Welcome to the next podcast from Millinery.Info. I'm your host, Lauren Ritchie. Thank you for joining me today for this episode with Lauren Martin. Lauren shares her journey from Melbourne, Australia to working in London workrooms creating unique pieces for the royal wedding in 2011. Now to her specialist field where she spends her time working and researching. I hope you enjoy this episode with Lauren today. I'd like to thank our wonderful podcast sponsors for making this episode possible. Be Unique Millinery, House of Adorn, The Essential Hat, That Millinery, Hatters Millinery Supplies, Lifted Millinery, Hat Academy, Hats by Lego, Hat Mags, Marie D'Antoni Millinery, Louise Macdonald Milliner, Millinery Australia, Best Western Apollo Bay Motel and Apartments, and Judith M. Millinery Supply House. You can find a link to each of these businesses in your show notes, which is on your podcast app or through our website. If you've been enjoying listening to this podcast series, I would like to invite you to sign up to be a Patreon of Millinery.Info. There is quite a lot that goes into producing, recording, and publishing this podcast, and this is a way you can show your support by signing up to be a supporter of Millinery.Info through Patreon. You can do this by visiting www.patreon.com/Millinery.Info. This helps us to continue to bring you content that you see and hear from Millinery.Info. I hope you enjoy this episode with Lauren. Thank you so much, Lauren, for joining us on the Millinery.Info podcast today. It's wonderful to have you as part of this series. Let's dive back right to the beginning. How did you first become involved with millinery?
Well, I think officially I first became involved. I studied costume at Swinburne University in Paran. I'm not sure it's even called Swinburne anymore, and I'm not sure the course exists as it did, but in 2001, 2002, I studied there, and we did millinery in the first year, but the second year we had Louise Macdonald come and teach us period millinery. So we had to do a women's hat and a men's hat, and I absolutely loved it. I had so much fun, and Louise was just an amazing teacher. And I did quite well with my hat, so I kind of thought, oh, okay, maybe I'm not bad at this. I never really thought, a job as a milliner existed. I'd always done dancing, done ballet. Up until I was about 17, and always made costumes, for the shows, and always loved making the headdresses, but they were literally like, wire from Bunnings with Christmas beads wrapped around type thing, so, but it was just so much fun. I never actually realized it could be an actual job, I suppose, until I got to Swinburne and realized that's what Louise did. And I was like, oh, okay, this is interesting. But yeah, it was mainly through that and through her that kind of led me on the path I'm on now. So yeah, that was the beginning.
Did you keep studying millinery through that course, or what were the next things you did from there once you discovered this amazing career path?
Well, because I'd done costume, I thought I was going to be a costume maker. So that's what I did initially. But I didn't know how big the millinery scene was in Melbourne. And I had a call one day from a lady named Susan Drorup, who ran a shop called The Essential Hat on High Street in Paran. And she said that Louise Macdonald had recommended me as someone who might want to come and work for Spring Racing Carnival. I thought, okay, this is good, paid work, so this could be fun. So that was, I can't even remember what year it was now. Oh, crumbs. 2004, maybe 2003. Anyway, doesn't really matter. But she used to have kind of freelance people come in each year, and she just loved teaching new people. And yeah, so I went and did that for about 6 or 8 weeks, all the while still making costumes. And I kind of did both. I went and worked for Sue for another 2 seasons after that, but also got a job at the Australian Ballet as a costume maker. So that was really good fun, and I loved both, really. I couldn't really, I was glad I never had to decide and choose one or the other. But I just built up so much experience working with Sue, and having all the customers come in the shop, and the crazy Spring Racing Carnival. I mean, I think each year there used to be like 500 or 600 hats go out, that we'd make over the space of 6 to 8 weeks. So it was
amazing.
Yeah, it was really busy. It was stressful, I think, mostly for Sue, but just the people I got to meet working with in her little team. She had a little team at peak time of about, 5 or 6 people. So that was quite nice too. I've met lots of, really good friends working there. So yeah.
You're working for Sue making spring racing hats. Were you making other pieces outside of that at that time?
Not hats, no, I don't think. I think I was still mostly costume. So I was doing lots of costume bits, freelance. I don't think I ever felt like a proper milliner. I felt like I was always someone who came to help to make the hats, if that makes sense. I kind of Sue always, proclaimed that she was never a milliner. She's like, Lauren, I'm not a milliner. I'm not a proper milliner. I just have a hat shop and I sell hats and I know how to make the hats. I think she always looked up to Louise, like, oh, Louise is a milliner. But Sue had an incredible talent. And, she taught me loads about sewing and hats and the customers. And so I think I always just felt like, not the helper, but not a proper milliner, I did go and do a course maybe to help me feel like a proper milliner, and that was at the Melbourne School of Fashion. I don't know if that still exists either. And that was 1 year, every Wednesday evening for about 30 weeks with a tutor named Sarah Connors. And she'd worked in England. She had been head of workroom, I think, at Frederick Fox. So we just got to learn kind of everything. We got to learn how to block felt, how to block straw, how to block cinnamate, etc. So I think after that, and I think it was a certificate in millinery construction and design or something, I don't know. I think after that, maybe I felt more like a proper milliner, but yeah.
And eventually you moved over to England. What led you over there?
I think maybe the costume world, because I worked at the Australian Ballet. There was another girl there who I was working alongside. She went and got her visa to work in England, and she worked at the Royal Ballet. And I did love working at the ballet, but I was in the men's department. I was mostly just making tights and, tops and and it was fine. But after 18 months, I thought, well, maybe it's time for a new challenge. So because my mum is English, I can get a British passport and British citizenship. So I did that. And I bought a one-way ticket to London.
How brave.
I bought it in 2005, a week before the 7/7 bombs went off. So I bought my ticket, and then a week later, all that happened in London, and it was a bit like, oh, where am I going? What's happening? But 6 months later, in January 2006, I flew to England, never having left Australia. So I was, 23. It was good fun.
And what did you do when you got there?
Bit of sightseeing. It was January, so it was freezing cold. It was really grey. I don't think I saw the sun for about a week. And having come from a really hot Australian summer, it was that really hot summer where we had a really 40-degree New Year's Eve or something. It was really, really, really hot. And landing in London where it was, 2 degrees or something. And it was a real shock, but it was fun because it was London. It was all big and exciting and just like I'd seen on TV, and I suppose I explored a bit, and then money ran out quite quickly. So I had to get a job. So I went to work in a pub, which was really good fun. It was kind of a bit of that, a bit of office work and a bit of costume freelance work for about 2 years, I think. I did all sorts of different things. It was an interesting time.
Great. And then you shifted back into millinery. How did you start considering a position after doing those freelance work?
So I think I'd been there nearly 2 years. So about November 2007, I'd been working all different jobs. As I said, office work, costume work, pub work. And it was a particularly bleak November. I was going out to a temp office job out near Heathrow. And out there, it's really grim. If you've ever seen The Office, it's just that kind of environment. It's just really, and I was on the train, on the tube, and the free newspapers that you get on the tube. I was reading that, and because the journey was so long, I managed to get right to the end to where the jobs were at the back. There was a job at the back, and it just said milliner, experienced milliner required. And I was like, you never see that. That's weird. I wonder how experienced they mean, you know. So I got to this temp job, and as soon as I got my first tea break, you know, like I was outside on the phone, like calling up to see, like, you know, what the deal with the job was. And I phoned up, and as soon as I answered the phone, they said, hello, Philip Treacy, London. And I just went, oh God, that's a shame. I'm never going to get a job there. Oh no, that's, well, you know, So, but, you know, I told them who I was, my experience, and they said, oh, well, yeah, if you can send your CV in, that would be great. So I did. It turned out, long story short, I probably had about the right amount of experience they wanted. They don't want someone who doesn't know anything, and they don't want someone who's had their own label, who knows lots of stuff, who kind of wants to come in and, you know, kind of, you know, shout their own ideas, etc., etc. So I had a little bit of experience, and I got invited for an interview. So that was exciting and nerve-wracking, just because, yeah, I still felt like little old me from Melbourne, Australia. I thought, okay, well, I wonder if I'll actually get to meet Philip. I wasn't sure if I would or not, but so I dressed up and very nervously went for an interview. And yeah, it was great. As soon as I walked in, Philip was wearing like jeans and a hoodie and Converse trainers. And I just immediately relaxed. I just thought, oh, thank God. Like, you know, I was expecting something like in The Devil Wears Prada, where it was going to be really like high fashion, but it wasn't. It's on a kind of semi-industrial estate in Battersea, which is in South London. And the building's just not super fancy. And yeah, I just had a nice chat. I only had one hat with me in the country. That was the only hat I took. And I didn't realize till I got to the interview that I had machine stitched the Petersham inside this felt hat. And I just looked at it and I just went, oh my God, like of all, like I could have at least like taken it off and hand stitched it. But it had loads and loads of embroidery on it. And I made it as part of the course I did in Melbourne. So it was a little felt pillbox hat, and I had loads of stump work embroidery. And that was a bit he zeroed in on the embroidery, and he was looking at like there's these tiny little stitches. And I think he saw like, okay, you're capable of lots of tiny little stitches. Okay, yeah, cool. So that was that. And then they said, okay, well, we'll get you in for a second interview. And so I was really excited. I thought, oh, I might be in with a chance here. Like I thought I'd be up against like, you know, 50 people like all fighting for this job. But I came for the second interview, and they basically just took me on a tour of the building and said, oh, well, this is where your desk will be, and this and that and the other, and the person who you're replacing, she's leaving in December, and, you know, when can you start type thing. And I was like, oh, okay.
Did you say tomorrow?
Pretty much. I think, as I said, this interview was in November, and I really didn't want to go back to temp office work. So I just said, look, yeah, I can start in January, but if you need me sooner, like I can come, like, you know, in a week's time. And I think they said, yeah, let's do that. So I had about a 3-week crossover period with the person who I was replacing. And thank goodness I did, because yeah, literally thrown in at the deep end. It was quite intense.
What type of things were you doing in the workroom there?
So in Philip's workroom at that time, so that was late 2007, early 2008, there was about 5 or 6 of us, I think, full-time permanent milliners, and he had a head of workroom. And Philip, you know, Philip has a desk in the room as well. And it's a crazy busy room, and there's just lots going on, and it looks really, really messy. I suppose it is a bit, but, you know, basically everything's going on all the time. So there's production for all the big department stores, so like Harrods and Harvey Nichols and all that sort of thing. So that kind of runs, I suppose, the whole year. So you're making the hats from the collection, to send to those shops all over the world. You know, I used to get excited when we'd be doing like the Maya and David Jones orders, and like, oh, these hats are going to Australia, how exciting, you know, and seeing what people have ordered. And but you know, big batches, so there might be 2 or 3 of one hat, there might be 10 of another hat, there might be 15 of another hat, and so you'd be given certain styles from the collection. So a collection of about 60 hats in summer, or maybe 40 hats in winter. You might have between, I don't know, 5 and 10 different styles that you would make, and you didn't make other people's styles, so you just made your ones.
So you kind of specialized.
Kind of specialized. It was just easier, quicker, because a lot of the styles were kind of variations from the season before. So it might just be a different color straw with a different kind of flower and a different, you know, feather, but essentially were very similar, you know, shape to the previous season. So it just made sense to get the person who knew how to make that shape to keep on doing it. So that was fine. It did get a bit like boring, maybe some of them. You just, you know, after a year or so, and you're like, oh, okay, this is the 4th version of this hat, right? Okay, I know how to make this one now. This one's, I know. You know, it was exciting when you got, you know, the newer, more complicated things, you know, thrown at you. So, and I suppose the biggest challenge was, I suppose, making the multiples. So again, like, not just making one hat, but okay, here you go, make 6 at a time, identical hats. And oh yeah, you've got 3 days, you know, like, so just juggling all those big lists of hats. And then I suppose at Ascot and like London Fashion Week, Paris Fashion Week, New York Fashion Week, all that, that's when all the extras used to get thrown in. So Ascot was really busy, and that's when you do all the stuff for all the big catwalk shows, and it was just always busy. Yeah.
And from there, how long were you in that workroom for?
From 2007, I finally left in 2013. And I had a couple of breaks in between. Breaks where I actually did quit and leave, but then came back. So there were 2 breaks. Both of those breaks, I did come back to Australia just to see my family, just to have, you know, a bit of time away. But both times, Philip had said, you know, like, oh, I'm sorry to see you go, and you know, you can always come back if you want to. So I'm not sure they can, you know, when people say that, they completely mean it, you know, if you're going to take them up on it. But I did. I literally phoned Philip and said, Philip, I'm coming back. Can I come and work for you, please? You know, so, you know, that was nice. But yeah, after 2013, I turned 30 in 2012. I think once you get to 30, it was, yeah, it got a bit much.
It's about time. And what were some of the memorable projects you got to work on while you were in the workroom?
So the biggest standout, I suppose, was the royal wedding in 2011. So that was April, and I think she became engaged in like November or December the year before. So as soon as she got engaged, we were like, okay, like, this is us. Like, you know, we're gonna be busy, I think. And I mean, in a perfect world, people would get their hats ready 6 months before the wedding, you know, but I suppose nobody knew if they were going to be invited or not, and, you know, that kind of thing. So I think most orders came in maybe, you know, 2 months before. I think everything started getting really sorted a month before, but then it just got crazy. We had TV crews coming in from literally all over the world to come in and talk to us. They were filming us, you know, just, it was absolutely bonkers. Yeah, I mean, I think even ABC News came in, you know, like every you know, few hours there was a different news crew. So Philip would say, everybody, this is the news team from Venezuela, say hello. Da, da. This is the news team from, you know, da, 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 da. And then they're like, this is the news team from Australia. And then it's like, Lauren's from Australia. Lauren, say hello. Da, 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 da. It's just like, oh my God, I just know. You know, my mum's trying to say this. We were literally like, you know, trying to stitch all these hats, because there were 37 or 38 hats, I think, and every single hat was different from each other. Every single hat had a different block. A lot of the blocks had been made specially for the hats for the wedding. So it was brand new hats. And I mean, the first time you make any new hat always takes a long time, but these were like, you know, super, super special, like couture hats. I learned a lot. It was good.
From then, did those styles kind of shift into the mainstream styles, or the main collection from there? Were people then going on to order those styles, or it was an exclusive for that event?
I think a lot because of the, how do I put it? The reaction to some of the hats was quite extraordinary, I guess. None of us really expected, we just thought, okay, the royal wedding's on, everyone's just going to be all about, William and Kate and and the hats will be there, but no one will care about the hats. But of course, in the week afterwards, the hoo-ha over the Beatrice hat was just insane. And that was one of the hats I was working on. So I worked on Beatrice, I worked on Eugenie. I worked on Tara Palmer Tomkinson's hat, and I also made one for the Dowager Duchess of Devonshire. So they were my main four, and I didn't work 100% on each one, just because in the workroom by that stage a lot of us had quite similar skills at a certain level, so it was quite easy for us to pass hats to each other if we had to work on one thing. Philip might say, oh, Lauren, can you pass that to Teresa, and she can do this. So all our skills were interchangeable, and really you can't tell our work from each other, if that makes sense. So
Which
I can't
is a skill
completely
unto itself.
yeah, and we just got used to it, but I suppose it's not a usual thing for other milliners to hand the hat you're working on to another milliner and let them work on it, and then you get it back and you you finish working on. So a lot of the hats we made absolutely had 2, 3, 4, 5 hands working on them, and you couldn't be precious. You just had to kind of just go with it. It was great. It meant you didn't have to make the whole hat.
Was there a surprise to the response from Beatrix's shape? Because it was compared to things like antlers and a toilet bowl seat, and it just shocked people as to the shape of it. So how was I don't know if you can share too much, but what was the reaction within the team that were making it?
Well, that night we worked really late. There were just so many hats to finish, and it wasn't that it was badly organized or that we couldn't do it. There were just so many hats, and I left the workroom at 6:30, 7 in the morning, and got home, turned on the TV, I think poured myself a glass of wine. I didn't even go to bed. I just was like, I've just got to go with this, because I had loads of friends coming over to watch the wedding. So basically when I saw the wedding, I'd had no sleep, and I saw all the people arriving, and I saw all the hats. I was like, oh, this is and I suppose social media was around then, but maybe not quite as big as, say, Instagram and Twitter are now. So I think now I probably would have jumped straight on Instagram to see what the world was saying, but I'm not sure how I found out that the world just absolutely hated that hat. I saw it was getting a bit of attention maybe in the news, but I suppose it wasn't until the weeks afterward that all the newspapers just made such a big deal. I was like, oh, okay. We didn't foresee it. We thought maybe her sister's hat might get more attention just because it was such a bright blue. It was really quite bright. But no, that's the one the media kind of, picked up and ran with. And, Philip wasn't bothered at all. He was like, well, people are talking about the hat. It's got people talking. It's got people animated. It's got people, discussing. That's what you want in life, isn't it? You want people to discuss things. So he wasn't offended. And I think Beatrice, she wasn't bothered at all. She put the hat up for auction on eBay. And it raised like £81,000 or something ridiculous. It went to America, and now it's in the Met Museum. So that's kind of cool.
It's really cool. So once you finished up with Philip there, what was next for you in your millinery career?
Well, so obviously I'd had royal wedding in 2011. In 2012, Philip did his first catwalk couture show, first one in 8 years. So I hadn't been there for one, and everyone said, oh, he hasn't done one for ages, this one's going to be really big, and they got loads of sponsorship and loads of funding, etc. And it was at the Royal Courts of Justice in London, and he used Michael Jackson's costumes that had been that were being auctioned, I think. So Michael Jackson's actual clothes were worn by all the models.
Cool.
And he had all black models, wearing these clothes, and all the hats that we made. So we did about 35 hats for that. That was really, really big. I think that was almost as big for me as the royal wedding. And after that, so that was September 2012. After that, I was done. I was just like, it was another all-nighter. It was just really, it took a lot out of me. And yeah, I needed a break. So I think I left after that and went back to Australia. I think I came and did some teaching for Louise, and I did some other teaching as well. And when I went back to England, I met my now partner, who's from Nottingham, on a ski trip in France, which sounds really, really glamorous, and it was good fun. But yeah, but basically, so I was in London, he was in Nottingham, and I suppose my focus just wasn't London anymore. And so I left. I came up to Nottingham to do the third year of a BA course in costume, just so that I could have my degree. And yes, I moved up to Nottingham in 2013 and have kind of lived here ever since. So yeah, kind of went back into the costume world, still doing bits of millinery, but not really still, because I suppose consider myself more of a proper milliner, but still, no, Philip's the milliner. I'm not a milliner, I just make hats. Yeah, I started my little Etsy shop around that time as kind of like a sideline for something to do whilst freelance work was happening. So that was interesting, because it was the first time I was making what I wanted to make and what I thought the world might want, which was kind of like vintage style hats. I didn't really want to make modern things. I wanted to make the things that I would like to wear. So I researched lots of things and made like little 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s hats, but then realized like you can still buy lots of that stuff. So, unless you're doing something really kind of, I don't know, different, it's, people can buy a 1950s hat fairly easily and not too expensively. So, yeah, I've kind of continued, the costume work as well as the millinery work ever since, but it's only recently, maybe in the last 3-4 years, that it's kind of gone really, really historical instead, and I've really discovered what I like to make. So yeah, it's a bit niche.
And what is this specialist area? Because you've gone on to some very not intense is the right word, but very specialist area of study as well.
So I think it was even something Louise said once about when she worked at Cosprop in London, because I knew she had that theatrical millinery background when she worked in London, and that she'd learned, maybe it was an interview I read or something with her, where she said something about she got to study all the hats, that they had in stock, and learn a lot about how they were made by studying, real examples of old hats. And there's not many books that tell you how to make old hats. And I thought, okay, so that's how you learn how to make old hats. You find actual old hats and you copy them. So in 2019, I bought on Etsy an 1830s bonnet. It was not that expensive. And as soon as I got it, I saw it and I thought, oh, I want to try and make this because, it just looks like fun, etc., etc. So I did a reproduction of it and enjoyed it so much and learned so much. I kind of realized maybe there was some further study in this. So I approached someone about doing an MA kind of on the topic of 1830s millinery. And she was really enthusiastic. She was like, yeah, that sounds amazing. Da, 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 da. So next thing I knew, I was doing an MA on 1830s millinery and milliners in England. And it was just so much fun. It was amazing. I learned so much. And I mean, the crazy thing is that the millinery industry, how milliners work, there are so many parallels with how we still work today. So that's kind of what my continuing area of research is going to be. And I've got loads more bonnets now to make and copy, and yeah.
When you were looking at that, the first thing that comes to mind for me is the materials that we have available today versus what it would have been made in. Did it align? Could you source them? How did that go?
The good thing, I mean, the good thing about having the bonnet yourself, there's loads of bonnets in museums, but different museums have different rules about what you're allowed to do to the hat. So some museums you're allowed to pick them up and touch them and really see inside. Other museums like the V&A, they bring them out on these kind of padded cushions on a table, and you can't even see under the brim. You can't see inside. No one's allowed to pick up the bonnet, you know. So it's like, okay. But when you have the bonnet yourself and it's yours, you can do whatever you like with it. I mean, I'm fairly careful, you know, I don't kind of rip holes in it, but you can see inside and you can feel the weight of the wire. You can feel the weight of the silk. You can see what the crown is made of. And the crown in this one was made of cardboard. It just had normal cotton covered wire, and it was just silk, and it had like a kind of cane in these little rib things. So I was like, okay, I can find the materials, you know, I can replicate. So I kind of replicated with what I had. I've since made about five or six of the same bonnet with different materials each time, just to kind of see the difference. I'm working on one at the moment. It's going to go on display in a museum in Yorkshire in March. This is probably the closest I can get. I found this silk that is just as close as possible to the weight of the original. And I'm using all my treasure vintage materials to kind of put this one together, and it's looking good. Yeah, it's been good fun. So yeah, I think we've got it lucky over here in England. There's a lot more access to materials than there is, say, in Australia. In America, there's interesting materials. There's different materials again. I didn't find I lived in Canada for a year. I didn't find loads in Canada, but I think here in England, we're quite lucky. You can buy lots of vintage stuff still, and eBay is my main haunt. I just, you know, yeah, love finding original materials, and they're not super common, but they are out there. So yeah.
So here's the big question is, what is your stash like of materials?
Oh, well, it's big. I took a studio, an external studio in July last year, just because I was always working from home. And I suppose when you become a milliner, I suppose you don't maybe sometimes even realize it's happening. It's not a conscious decision. Like, you know, you go work for other milliners and all the stuff is there at their house or their studio, et cetera, and you start working from home, but you kind of think, well, I work from home, maybe I'm not a proper milliner, But I suppose moving out to a proper studio was another, I suppose, big tick that I was like, oh, actually, maybe I'm actually doing this. Like, maybe this is my job. Like, you know, I still sometimes have to pinch myself. I don't quite believe it's true. But when I took on the studio, I realized quite how much stuff I have. And we got rid of a lot when we went to Canada, but I came back from Canada with lots of stuff, and it's kind of steadily grown. Yeah. I'll have to take pictures and put them on Instagram to see my new studio. But yeah, I don't think I've got a lot compared to other people. I've just got, the thing about millinery is you can keep tiny bits of fabric and they're all going to be useful. So I've got about 7 boxes just of tiny bits of fabric. I've got, you know, a braid box. I've got about 5 boxes of ribbon and, you know, just stuff.
So did you mention you're moving studios at the moment?
Yeah, so the first studio I took was great, but the ceilings weren't very high, so I couldn't stack my boxes. So I saw a different one where I can stack the boxes a bit higher. And it just means I've got more storage for the stuff, you know, for the hats. And it's lucky that hats are quite light. You know, fabric is not, and books are not. So that's the downside. But yeah, the hats at least aren't heavy. So.
Yeah. And how much time do you get to spend in your studio?
Never as much as I'd like. I think the trouble when I had it at home was that I spent too much time in it, because you could always just kind of nip in like in the evening or at the weekends, and you burn yourself out. You end up working too much and you never leave it alone. Now I get to go in the morning, sit down, you know, get into the day, and then I'm always amazed at how quickly 5 o'clock comes around and I have to leave and go pick up my little boy, you know, and just come home, and I'm not allowed to do anything to do with hats, until maybe I'll do something in the evening, but very rarely anymore. So at the moment, officially, I'm there 4 days a week, but also I teach costume at one of the universities here in Nottingham. So they steal me. It's been for quite a few days this year, but at the moment it's kind of 1 day a week. Sometimes it's 4 days a week. So I'm always, I don't know if I feel like I'm always fighting to have the time. I always wish I could have more time, but yeah.
And what projects are you working on at the moment?
Well, so most of my work, I call myself a theatrical milliner, but I don't even know if that's probably what I should be at panto time. So December, November over here, all across the country. They have pantomimes in every single city. Loads of costumes, really kind of leery, bright colours, and that's a really busy time of year for me. So last year I did, I think, 3 different pantos, and that was about 25 hats. The year before it was COVID, so not that many, but it's super, super busy. So that's my big theatrical bit. But the rest of the time through the year, I do a lot of work for a dress historian and historical dressmaker called Meredith Town. So she works a lot with, say, English Heritage and the National Trust and all these places. And they have costumes either for the interpreters, so the people who take you on tours of these big stately homes, or for the education things, so the children who come to do school visits. And they want costumes to try on. So I end up just making loads and loads of either child size or adult size Tudor hats or Georgian hats or bicorns or tricorns or, English Civil War hats. They always want those. They're really boring to make, but, it's at the moment I've got, I think, about 16 Tudor hats to make for the 23rd of March. So yeah, that will that's a big job. That's gonna a few days on that one. But so yeah, just things like that. I think I'm booked now for the next few months, just doing those things and teaching. So it was a bit scary, kind of setting up a studio and officially calling myself a milliner, but so far so good.
It sounds like that's something that took a lot of time for you to come to as a position, being comfortable with calling yourself a milliner. Was there a particular day where you're like, this is it, I'm now a milliner versus a technician?
I don't know. I suppose it's because when I worked at Phillips, I always saw him as a milliner. He never called himself a milliner. He didn't like the term. And I think it's because he refers back to the 18th century and early 19th century definition of a milliner, which was, somebody who sold women's, fancy wares, et cetera, et cetera. So caps and hats and ribbons and da-da-da-da-da. So not just making the hats, but it was a shop that sold, So he calls himself a hat designer. And I thought, well, I'm not a designer. I don't like designing the hats. I like problem solving the hats. I like figuring them out. I don't really like having the responsibility for, like the concept type thing. So I've always just considered myself, the technician, the problem solver. I think one of the times I landed back in Australia and they ask you your job and you have to fill it out on the form. I think I did put milliner, but that's because I worked for Philip at the time. So I thought, I can put milliner. I'm sure that's fine. But I don't know. I think maybe I just can't settle on one job. I do like teaching and I do like other bits. So some days I'm an academic, doing research like for the MA. Some days I'm a teacher. Some days I'm a milliner. And I don't know. Maybe it's too hard to commit to just one job.
Well, it sounds like you don't need to, and it's a lovely, lovely balance. So what's up next for you in your research area?
Well, so the MA was good. It was really hard work, but I really enjoyed it.
So sorry, just so before you go, it's a master's, is that the right? What's the?
Yes, so it's a complicated one. It's so you can do over here. You can do an MA. You can have like a taught MA where you attend a university like once or twice a week, and they have classes. And you can have like an MA in art or an MA in all different things. But I found one that was an MA by research. So a Master's of Arts by Research. And that meant that you didn't attend classes. You kind of had to do it all yourself in a way. Like you had to be kind of self-led. You had a supervisor who you met with once a month. And I thought, well, yeah, I can go up to Huddersfield, which is where I did it once a month. But then COVID hit anyway, so it was all on Zoom, so it was fine. And basically, yeah, I just chatted with my supervisor once a month, and I did all the research and wrote a 25,000-word thesis on 1830s millinery. It was good. It was good. But there were so many things that came up when I did that I thought I really would like to do more. I found so much information about materials that they used. I mean, we think that materials disappear now, but it's been happening, for centuries, like materials come and go. And so stuff that they used to make hats out of, all those technologies have disappeared. And, I really want to know what the milliner's studio looked like back in, 1830, 1840, 1850, because there's no pictures. But you can kind of get a glimpse by reading newspaper articles and seeing what was in the shops. And, no one's, to me, it's really obvious. I'm like, this is amazing. Like, doesn't everybody love this? But no one's written any books on it yet. Or, there's no books with loads and loads of patterns for hats. Like all the bonnets I'm making, there's no books with that in. So, I mean, ultimately, that would be a lovely thing to do is, produce a book with patterns for bonnets, but also, continue the research into milliners and making and, how we make stuff and how it's still so relevant today.
So with the challenges of lockdown and COVID and not being able to necessarily visit places, how did you go about your research? What were some of the resources you were drawing on?
I suppose when I set out, I thought I would go visit all the collections I could in the country over here. There are so many museums over here with so many hats and stuff, and I managed to get to 3 before COVID hit and lockdown. So that was cool. But even after I'd started seeing the bonnets, I thought, oh, maybe I'm not going to write just about the hats. I was getting more interested in the lives of the milliners and, how they worked. And all of that was coming from the census and the British newspaper archives and just things like maps and like trade directories and all these sorts of things. I basically mapped out like 1830s Nottingham where I think there were like at one point 45 milliners. And because Nottingham's not that big, I could walk around the streets and I knew all the streets and I could kind of see where all these women were, and yeah, so all of that's online. It's amazing. I mean, 20 years ago, it wouldn't have been possible, but now all these newspapers are there, all the census is on there, and Google Maps, that's amazing. Like you can just find anything, can't you? So a lot of it, was kind of online stuff. And also all the books I needed, lots of stuff has been digitized. All the stuff I was looking at was published, in the Victorian period. So it's all been digitized by all these libraries and it's available. It's all free. Like it's all sitting there. It was not as hard as you might imagine. So yeah.
Really interesting. And what surprised you in when you're researching? What was the thing that surprised you most?
Surprised me most, just the variation in what I suppose a milliner was back then. There were loads of people who listed themselves as milliner in the census, but you looked up their names and they didn't have a business, so they must have worked for a milliner. So you could call yourself a milliner if you worked for a milliner, but if you had your own shop, you were also a milliner. And then there were some people who were like, no, I'm a straw bonnet maker, or I'm a bonnet maker, or I'm this, or I'm, and there were so many little variations. And it was just kind of interesting. I just thought, I wonder if we've got this idea that back then, what was the career path? I mean, lots of women gave it up when they got married, whether they wanted to or not, we don't know. I mean, maybe they hated it and found the rich man plan and off they went, and just, but there was one milliner and she became a bit of a feature in my thesis. She had a shop in the same spot for over 60 years. And you hear all these horror stories that, being a milliner or a dressmaker in the Victorian period was just like terrible, like the conditions were horrible, like why would anybody want this job? And yet she did it for, till she was in her 80s, I think. And you just think, well, it can't have been that bad. Like, she had this little shop in the same place. And maybe she didn't want to get married, or you can't know. You're just guessing. But I think, the reputation for milliners, was that it was not a brilliant job to have. But I have a feeling that there were quite a few women where it was a really good career opportunity. You could be a kind of entrepreneur without causing too much fuss, without making too many ripples. You know what I mean? It was, so that was a surprise.
And where are you exploring next in your research?
Geographically, I'm not really sure. I'll probably stick to England just because at the moment it's easier. Still COVID times, so travel not as easy, but there's lots of amazing museums in America that I'd quite like to go and poke around in and see all their hats. Their online collections are phenomenal in terms of what has been digitized. I found so many more bonnets on American websites than I have on UK ones. So I was like, oh, that's interesting. Like, why the American ones? Maybe they've got more money, etc., etc. But yeah, definitely like to go see some American bonnets. I think that would be good fun.
What is an upcoming project that you're looking forward to working on?
I'm finally going to get some time to make the other bonnets that I've bought. So I've got a collection, I think, of about 10 or 12 other Victorian bonnets, and I've started taking patterns. I keep waiting for like some free time, like so that I could sit and do it, but I never get any free time. I'm thinking that by June I'll probably be free, and I've got 2 interns, 2 work placement people coming to work with me this summer, so that will be nice. They're going to be there for like most of June and July, so hopefully they can help and I get to teach them, all the stuff that I was taught. And I suppose maybe it's come full circle a bit. It's quite a novel experience to have, work placement students, because this is, I think, what are we now? 2002 was when I was first taught by Louise, so 20 years later. Don't tell Louise it's 20 years, because it doesn't feel like 20 years, it feels like much, much less. I get to have my own little students, so yeah, that will be nice.
Fantastic. Well, best of luck in your research, and I can't wait to see what you discover next in the world of 1830s millinery. Thank you so much for sharing with us, and it was lovely to have you as part of our podcast.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you for inviting me. It's been a real honour to be asked.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Millinery.Info with Lauren. Thank you to our wonderful podcast sponsors for their support: Judith M. Millinery Supply House, Millinery Australia, Louise Macdonald Milliner, Marie D'Antoni Millinery, Best Western Apollo Bay and Apartments, Hat Mags, Hats by Lico, Hat Academy, Lifted Millinery, Hatters Millinery Supplies, That Millinery, The Essential Hat, House of Adorn, and Be Unique Millinery. You can find a link to each of these businesses in our show notes. This is on your podcast app or on our website. If you'd like to become a Patreon of Millinery.Info, there are 2 tiers available: a podcast sponsor, which means your business or event is mentioned in our podcast, link included in the Millinery.Info website and the monthly newsletter. We also have a supporter tier, which is from just $5 a month. It's a little more than shouting us a coffee a month. It's for those who would like to quietly show their support, but also their appreciation for the content we produce on Millinery.Info. If you have any questions about becoming a Patreon, I'd love to hear from you. Otherwise, head over to www.patreon.com/Millinery.Info. I'm your host, Lauren Ritchie. Thank you so much for joining me today for this episode of Millinery.Info, and I look forward to talking hats with you again soon.